Welcome to the Empowered Team podcast. I'm your host, Kari Schneider, and today I'm going to give you one of those tools that is indispensable. This is one of the things that will make your life so much better because I promise you, you have, like me, probably had a few instances of miscommunication. Have you ever had that scenario where you think you've been crystal clear, you think you've been ideal in how you've communicated, only to find out that the other person heard something completely different? Maybe you find out by how they react. Maybe you find out by what they say back to you. Maybe you find out by something they do later. And you think to yourself, what the heck? I thought I communicated this. Clearly, they did not hear that or they did not receive that, whatever it was. This is what we call the interpersonal gap. This is a term coined by a person named John Wallen. So today I'm going to tell you about the interpersonal gap. I'm going to give you the 7 things that let you know the problems that come from the interpersonal gap. But more importantly, I'm going to give you the ways that you can make sure you bridge that interpersonal gap. There are 3 key things that'll really make a difference. But first you're going like, what even is the interpersonal gap? How do I know that I'm in an interpersonal gap? And what does it look like to bridge it? I don't know. So this is what it looks like. The interpersonal gap is that invisible gap when when you say something and they hear something else. It's the kind of thing where I remember I was talking with my husband and we were talking about the struggles we had in the past financially, and things were a little tight years ago, a lot tight years ago. And he said something like, well, we'd have, barely any money, and then somehow you'd come up with the several $1,000s that we needed to repair the sewer line from the house to the street when that emergency happened. And I said these words. I said, well, when I realized you weren't a saver, and I wasn't meaning it, there was no intention as an insult. But he got angry and I was deer in headlights thinking, well, wait a second. I just was saying that you weren't a saver, thinking that he wasn't a saver. And he started saying things like, and I barely spent on a coffee. And I, as I was hearing it, because I wasn't upset, I could hear what he was saying. And I realized that, he was thinking that I was saying he wasn't being careful with money. But what I meant was he wasn't setting money aside while he was being very careful with money. And that rift that was created in that gap then can easily get deeper or create more of a rift or rupture in the communication or even in the relationship. And we don't want that. So what we want in a workplace setting, in your home setting, in your life, is for this gap to be bridged. So why is this gap even there? So first of all, this is key to picture. I want you to picture one person. And one person in their own bubble of their world has their intention. And in that bubble of the world, their intention is private. Nobody else knows what their intention is when they're about to communicate. And when that intention is private, then they want to get that out into the world and they communicate some way. They might communicate with their actions, their words, their tone, their body language. They might communicate in all sorts of ways. But the difference between what they communicate and what their intention was, that's getting filtered. That's getting filtered by whatever they've experienced in their world, their bubble. That could be their parenting, how they were parented, the environment they grew up in, the society that they live in, the cultural norms that is in their area. And so whatever those things dictate, that usually influences what comes out of their mouth or what their body language is. So the intention is private. This person, their world, their intention is private. What they say or what their actions are is public. But whatever comes out as their actions has been filtered by their experience of the world. So there's filter number 1. Now, their intention has already been filtered. Now what comes out in the public is some sort of words, tone, movement, volume, body language, and that has to go through the second filter. And the second filter is the other person's filter, whatever their parenting experiences were, whatever their cultural norms or societal influences were. And that filter is the second filter. And then what happens for them in private is the impact. So we've got person number one, person number two, and person number one has an intention, and the ultimate result for person number two is the impact. Now, between those two places is all of those two filters, society, the actions that were public, and then finally the impact on the other person. That's where the gap lives. Now, I describe it as a little gap, but when you hear everything that's happening in that gap, we can now easily see that, holy cow, there's so much going on between what one person's intention was to the impact on the other person. There's a lot going on. It starts with, well, there's something in my head. I have a certain intention. I mean this, but I say that, and then someone hears something else, and they make that something else mean something different. So you can easily see how the original intention did not mean to have that impact. So we as humans have to figure out what has to happen, what needs to be done in order to bridge that gap. Because advanced communication, this is really important here, remember this, advanced communication is less about the communication and more about the understanding. And that's where this gap comes in. It's where the understanding is lost. Someone lost the understanding of how they need to communicate for that other person, and the other person lost the understanding of what was being intended along the way. So remember, advanced communication is more about understanding than it is about the communication or what's being said. Okay, so let's move on with this. Right there, you're probably thinking about a thing or two that's happened in your life. Maybe it's a hybrid work scenario where people met in person, but there's some people that are working remotely and they were in on that in-person meeting and somebody relayed what happened and it didn't all come across that gap. And these are when there are miscommunications. Somebody thinks one thing or something else. And it can be something so simple as a workplace, a colleague says, I really want you to step into this. I want you to lean in, step up a little more on this project. But the person who's listening to it hears something along the lines of, you're failing. You're not good enough. You're not doing a good job here. And this is where we really want to make sure that that gap isn't there, because the gap can stack. If that gap was there and it wasn't addressed and it wasn't clarified, no one really knew that the intention didn't land. Instead, there was a different impact than intended. Then that sits and it could fester. And then it's stacked if something else then happens. And this creates an emotional undercurrent that widens the gap. And then it creates a harder gap to bridge with communication. And then at some point, somebody just doesn't want to communicate anymore because they feel like it's just too much. There's too many misunderstandings. There's too many impacts that weren't the intention, and it's too hard to repair. And that's where you have frustrations in the workplace, people getting fired, relationships breaking down. So this interpersonal gap is so critical. And it really begins with the understanding and the awareness that what I'm intending probably isn't going to land the way I intend. If you can just default to understanding that there's so much between your intention and the other person's impact, that you want to just understand that it's likely not going to fully land the way I want to. So I'm going to have to sift through it from the get-go, from the very beginning. Because if you do it from the very beginning, there's so much less to deal with later on. So how do we even bridge this gap? This is where we're like, oh, this sounds hard. If I don't know what's going on, and there's all these filters, there's filter 1, there's filter 2, there's what they're making it mean, there's what I've made it mean, and all this that was private, what's public, did I actually communicate something with my body that I didn't mean to? Because my intention was this, but I said that, and then my tone was weird. So what does this look like? So the first thing we want to do is really check in on our intention. Does my intention actually, am I communicating with my words and my body what my intention is? Because if I'm not, the other person is automatically going to sense that. We want alignment. We want to make sure that how we're communicating is congruent with what we're actually believing and what our intention is. So when you start to have that intention, or you start to speak, make sure that you've done a self-check. My intention here is not to attack somebody. It's not to tell them that they're not doing a good job. My intention here is for us to collaborate and make the best job possible. When you internally understand that, then the question becomes, how do I communicate that so that they understand that it's about collaboration and that it's about us doing the best job possible together? Then getting that across is so pivotal. What we want to look at is, after we've said something, we have to do another check. The other check is, what did they hear? Because you also want to assume, if you've done the check on whether you're aligned or not, you also want to assume that they may not have heard what you said. We always tend to, I'm using absolutes here, I realize this. We tend to assume the opposite. We tend to assume that we communicated in a crystal clear fashion and they heard what we said. We want to assume otherwise. We want to assume that there was room for interpretation. We want to assume that they heard something different than we said simply because they have a different experience of the world than we do. And when we assume that, it puts us in the space of trying to understand what they heard from what we said. Now, it's not so hard when you think about it. All we want to do is hear what they heard. What did you hear from what I said? So the first thing can be, can you play that back to me in your words, what you heard me say? If they repeat the exact words that you said, because I've had this happen hundreds of times with children, raising children, you go, okay, tell me what I just said. And they might reiterate, just regurgitate exactly what you said. But I don't know if they really understood. So then what has to be asked is, what does that mean to you? Well, that means I'm going to go get the salt and pepper. No, I asked you to prep the table for dinner. So getting the salt and pepper is part of that. What else might need to happen to prep the table for dinner? And then that opens up more understanding, because now I understand that they think that prepping the table for dinner means getting the salt and pepper out. If I was communicating with the kids, getting ready for a Thanksgiving dinner or something like that. And yet, they feel that they understood perfectly because that's what they normally do for a regular dinner. But this is a Thanksgiving dinner, so I didn't communicate in a way that they understood, and they heard something different than they thought I meant. So can you play that back to me in your own words? Can be very, very helpful to understanding what did they hear. And then you want to really understand the intention versus impact framing. Here's what I was meaning. When I said prep the table for dinner, what I meant is actually get the whole table set and get the place settings done and the salt and pepper and the water glasses, make sure all that's on there. That's what I was meaning. How did that land for you? Oh, I thought you just meant put the salt and pepper out like we do for a regular dinner, but you mean this for a Thanksgiving dinner or a Christmas dinner. And that's where we start to bridge, oh, this was my intention. This was the impact on you. And now I understand what you heard. Oh, and now I understand what you meant. So curiosity before clarity. You don't go and clarify what you meant until you understand what they actually heard. The clarity comes in when you have a greater understanding of what the differences are between your intention and what landed for them, what the impact was on them. Remember that there are so many other gaps that can occur from nonverbal cues. Maybe you were looking somewhere else when you made that communication with them. Maybe it was through a text or an email. Maybe there's a cultural difference between the two people. Maybe there was a tone that sounded a little short because you were annoyed about something else, had nothing to do about that actual conversation. So all these things contribute to the filters that are going on in this interpersonal gap. And we can see how easily it's like the game of telephone that's gone around the room of 20 people. And what started as, can you set the table, turned into, I don't know, are we going out for dinner? It's something completely different. So how do you know you're actually in the interpersonal gap? The first way you're going to know is usually there's some sort of defensive response. Now, a defensive response could be an eye roll. It could be a raise of the eyebrows. It could be a comment back. A defensive response could be almost anything, but there's some sort of defensive response. And when that happens, and I gave you an example with my husband and I back in the day, where it was that, oh, when I realized you weren't a saver, that to him was me attacking his character. But my intention was to explain my actions of having an emergency bucket of money that was not touched in case something went horribly wrong in our lives with children. And there was a huge gap there because he was hearing something very different from what I was saying. And then I also realized that his definition of saving and my definition of saving were two completely different things. To me, he was talking about spending less, and I was talking about actively putting money into something so that it built up. And they were just two different things, but there was that gap. And so when that happens, that can stack and create that defensive response. And if that defensive response is there, this is where we want to clarify. And sometimes it just means, oh, there's a misunderstanding here, and that wasn't my intention. And as soon as you say those things, that usually goes a long way for the person listening, realize, and the person who intended something different, then they can start to go, whoa, whoa, whoa. I did not mean to have that impact on you at all. That's not what I wanted to say. It's not that I felt you were not good with money or anything like that. That's not what I was meaning. So those defensive responses are a key sign that you're in the gap. It's a key sign that there's something that's gone awry. Another one is repeated clarification. So if you've said, hey, I'd like you to prep the table, and they say, do you want me to put the forks out? Yes. Do you want me to put the knives out? Yes. Do you want me to put the placemats out? Yes. When they keep asking those clarifying questions, then that's a big signal for you that whatever you intended to happen wasn't communicated very well by you, because they keep having to ask a whole bunch of questions. And this thing that happens in society now seems to be that we expect the other people to read our minds, and yet we feel like we shouldn't have to read somebody else's mind. The gap lives in that mind reading zone. If you think you're having to read somebody's mind, then you're living in the gap. You're living in that interpersonal gap. So if there's repeated clarification requests, by all means clarify, but that also is a signal to you to realize that your communication wasn't that great and you need to seek to understand what they heard. Another one is if there feels like there's tension, there's been a simple exchange and there's tension between the two of you or between you and the group, and you're kind of going, where's this tension coming from? That is another indication that you're going to have to seek to understand. And you can simply state it as such. I feel like there's some tension in the room. Maybe I'm missing something from what I said. What are you hearing from what I said? that can be very powerful in opening up. Well, it sounds like nothing we're doing is right. We're not getting anything that we worked so hard, and you've just told us that we have to do this and this, but it feels like nothing we've done is right. So that tension can be a beacon to bridge the gap. A last one is if you find yourself after communicating saying something like, "That's not what I meant." If you say that, then clearly, even if your communication was stellar and you end up saying that's not what I meant, something didn't land. And it's worth finding out what didn't land. And clearly your intention had a different impact than you intended, and that's worth cleaning out. Okay. So here are 3 ways that you can start using this interpersonal gap so that you can have greater, and when I say greater, I'm talking about much more advanced communication. It's not just communicating clearly. It's making sure that what you've communicated is understood. And what you can start with is by saying this, just practicing this line. What I'm trying to say is, and then you get to clarify what the intention is. What I'm trying to say is, I'd really like us to collaborate so this can go in the best possible direction. And you may not have said collaboration or the future, anything about the future in that first communication. It might have only been about, well, we have to do this and we have to do this. So what I'm trying to say is your opportunity to clarify your intention. A next one is checking in on the mood. If you're sensing that someone is down because of what you've said, then that would be a mood check-in. Or you check in on the mood before you bring the information because maybe the mood isn't conducive for what you're about to bring. Some of the communication that you might have to deliver could be tough to receive. If it's tough to receive, check in to see where the person is on their receptivity. They may not be ready for what you have to receive. So do a mood check-in. And another one is a silence scan. A silence scan is really good too because you want to pause, give yourself time to sense the gap. Give yourself just a little bit of space. And you can sense whether they're in tune to you or not. I was telling my daughter about a story from the past years ago when she was little. And I thought, in my mind, my intention was to share information with her about her youth, thinking she'd be entertained by it, thinking she'd want to know more about it. But I sensed and watched her silence, and her silence was her tuning out. And then I realized, oh, she's not really interested in this. But that allowed me to bridge the gap with, hey, it seems like you're not really into this story. I was telling you, my intention was to tell you about something about your past. Maybe you'd like it, but you don't seem so into it. She's like, oh, no, I'm not really. I'm kind of into this more right now. There you go. The gap is bridged. Bridge the gap. But it was the scan of the silence. Her lack of nodding, her lack of silence can be in the body too. The lack of body language cues. That can be telling you that there's a gap. So notice the gap. Notice the gap. Right now, I feel that this is more and more prevalent because we have more people checked out onto devices, onto texting, onto social media, and yet there's so much less communication cues to read. And people may not be as in tune with them because they've been communicating more and more via text. And then they assume that what they've intended has gotten across. So those are really important. Now, here are some of the issues that come up with interpersonal gaps. Because as you can hear, and I know that you've had an interpersonal gap. We all have. We probably have multiple per day if we're communicating with a lot of different people. And that's hard to manage, but it's worth it. It is worth bridging this gap. It is so worth bridging this gap, not only for the fulfillment and connection and this interpersonal depth, but also because the fallout, the pain from having too much of a stack of interpersonal gap can be a real problem. It's not good. So we've got misinterpretation of the intent. that leads to typically a negative impact. We don't want some big exploding impact. It might be something like, I said you could improve. They heard they're not good enough. So this is where those emotional filters or prior experiences or unclear delivery the intention gets misinterpreted. Unspoken assumptions. We talked about this earlier, that we're trying to read other people's minds or they're reading our minds. We think they can read our minds. No. A quick, can you handle this? A quick, hey, how's this landing for you? Figure it out. Figure it out. So these cognitive shortcuts and it creates this lack of explicit framing. But when we frame things with the intention, that mitigates a lot of the assumptions that end up being there. Instead of I just tell you what to do, tell the why behind it. Tell the intention behind it. Another one is those defensive reactions that I mentioned, as well as broken trust. So let's say there's been one or more interpersonal gaps. Trust is lost in buckets and earned back in drops. You are going to have some stellar communication, some stellar clarifying and intention communication in order to build back the trust if there has been a breach, if there's been a rift, if there's been a rupture. You're going to have to repair with really good communication afterwards. That means the onus is on you to figure out where that interpersonal gap is. You really have to make sure that's there. All right. Another one, and this is number 5, is communication fatigue. You feel like you're exhausted from trying to get the message across? This is hard. So if both parties stop trying to clarify and stop trying to connect, it leads to passive communication and often silence. And when that happens, it really ends up eroding the motivation to communicate. When you feel like you're on the same page, it's so exciting to communicate with another person because you feel like it's so easy, it's so fluid. They know exactly what you're going to say. They finish your sentences. Wow. Why? Why do they do that? Because they are so in tune with you that they're trying to see what your intention is. You are so in tune with them that your intention understands what might be the impact on the other side, and it's just fluid. But that's not always like that. You could be fatigued from work. You could be fatigued from trying to communicate with other people, and then you go to communicate with this person, and you get home, you don't want to talk to your spouse, you know they've always just understood you, so you don't put the same level of effort that you did at work with your peers or your colleagues or your employees. And then you find that, why is the communication so hard with my spouse when it used to be so easy, when you've just been exhausted from communicating at work and you don't do it at home? And then when you come home, you wonder why there's not that fluidity of communication, how easy it used to be, and now how it seems so hard. So there is a thing, decision fatigue, overall mental fatigue, communication fatigue is a thing. Make note, give yourself what you need before you get home or between meetings or before you're going into a really challenging conversation, so you can fill your own cup and make sure you're not going in depleted. Because I promise you, if you're going into a key communication and you are depleted, you're not going to be able to articulate your intention. You may not even be clear on your intention, and that's not going to go well for anyone. So make sure that you are taking care of you in order to make sure the communication can be top-notch. We don't want to erode the motivation overall. And then feedback breakdown. If the feedback that you get from your communication is hurtful or unproductive or confusing, and then you are not sure where to go with it, someone says to you, you've delivered some whatever needed to happen, and someone says, well, you need to be better at that, or you need to be more strategic. It's too vague, and then it creates this anxiety or this apprehension of, well, what does that mean? Am I supposed to take action? the lack of specificity in feedback can be very, very harmful. So note that for yourself. And if you're getting feedback like that, that's when you say, can you tell me an example of that? What does that look like as an example? I need some specificity. I need some more awareness around what you mean. And that can help you so that you're not in that feedback breakdown loop. Okay, next one and last one is escalation of minor issues. There can be a tiny little thing, and this has happened with my daughter and I. We're in the midst of a move. We're trying to pack a bunch of things, and a little lack of communication or a little miscommunication turns into something bigger because we're both tired. And she's had a busy week of activities and mine and work and trying to pack and driving her all over the place. And all of a sudden, this little miscommunication about the sports shoes or the lunch or the timing turns into something major. Why? Because there's fatigue, or there was an initial communication gap. There wasn't clarity and it wasn't done when it needed to be. And then there were assumptions made. So there are all kinds of issues that arise from this interpersonal gap. It's your role to do the key steps, the really, really easy things that seek understanding. If you are seeking understanding and communicating the intention, that right there will mitigate all sorts of interpersonal gaps. Remember, you're making a meaning, you're hearing something that's different than what they might be communicating, and they're communicating something different than maybe perhaps their intention. So look for all the clues and ask. Don't assume, don't try to read anyone's mind. Ask. Seek understanding. Understanding is far more important than the communication itself. So that's the advanced version of communication. Okay, now we've done all sorts of episodes. I want you to look back. We're going to look back in, I've got to look up the episode number actually, but we've done episodes on active listening, on the ACE technique, which is really amazing. It's our methodology, our framework around active listening, clear and concise communication, along with empathy. These are incredible tools, incredible techniques for you to have incredible communication. So we know how important this is in your entire life, not just the workplace, but the home life, you name it. So make sure that that communication is there and use all the tools you possibly can and practice them. Practice them. It won't be perfect right off the hop. Just keep practicing, and I promise you it will get better, and the rewards are unbelievable. The rewards of connection, deep connection, and seamless communication with other people feels fabulous. All right, you've got this. Keep going. Have a wonderful day. Share this with someone who you know wants to communicate amazingly, wants to have amazing communication. Share it out there and have a wonderful week.